Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On January 13th, 2024, people of the Republic of China, also known as Taiwan, will go to the polls to elect their next president. The race will be between the Taiwan People's Party, the Kuomintang, and their present ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, whose nominees are the current Vice President Lai Ching-te and his running mate, former Representative to the United States, Cho Kim, who both support independence and are the current front runners. Some say, however, their victory will only escalate tensions with mainland China, who, despite the fact they have never ruled Taiwan, claims the island as part of its territory and claims that the election is a choice between war and peace. Will the Taiwanese election bring prosperity or conflict? Next. Joining me today from Taiwan is Jono Thomson, reporter for the Taiwan News. Jono, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start off with this. I know Lai Ching-te is presently the current frontrunner for president of Taiwan, and two of the parties, Taiwan People's Party and also Kuomintang, they tried to create opposition by creating a coalition to go against them, but that is since falling apart. So where are we in the election right now?
Right. So, yeah, you're correct. Over the past couple of months, there's been a lot of media speculation about whether the Taiwan People's Party and the Kuomintang will collaborate. That sort of ended, about a week ago. And now where we are really is we can clearly see who's running for president and which parties have which candidates. You've got to remember that before the collaboration deal failed, we weren't actually sure who was going to be on the main opposition party's ticket, but now we are. So we have the Kuomintang with their presidential candidate Ho Yo-e, and he has announced a vice presidential pick. And we also have the Taiwan People's Party with a presidential candidate and a vice presidential pick, and also the incumbent Lai Ching-te, as you said, who has also made his presidential pick. So I think now we can sort of move towards real serious campaigning, and we know where we stand, and we can expect a bit more from the candidates in terms of what they will like to do for Taiwan instead of just sort of talking about how they'll cooperate in the election.
The Taiwan People's Party and the Kuomintang are both pro-China, or at least looking to be friendlier towards China. How is that playing out? Because the present frontrunner, quite frankly, is in favor of independence, although he has walked that back a little bit, saying that he's going to maintain the status quo. But his running mate also is also pro-independence, and she doesn't hide from that. So how is that playing out with the population of Taiwan now?
Yeah, so I understand what you mean when you say Lai Ching-te is pro-independence, and he has made statements to that effect in the past. But as a presidential candidate, he's stressed that he wants to maintain the status quo. But certainly, as you say, that's the view that China or Beijing has of him, that he is pro-independence. How is that playing out with the public of Taiwan? I mean, I think most people know where each of the main parties' candidates stand, and it won't be a surprise to them that Lai Ching-te has made it to the point where he is as presidential candidate. And with all of that history behind him, people are quite clear about what kind of candidate he wants to be. I think that the opposition Kuomintang party is certainly using that reputation for being a pro-independence advocate to differentiate themselves from the incumbents and saying, look, China has told us very clearly that independence is a red line for them. And here you have an incumbent candidate who has a history of campaigning for independence. They're saying choose us, and we will ensure that the kind of conflicts that might arise from any sort of independence rhetoric won't happen.
Now, should he win, what do you think the relationship would be between he and Beijing? Because Beijing, quite frankly, is not speaking to the current president, Tsai Ing-wen. So, how do you think that relationship will be should he win? And that's still not a clear conclusion yet, but he is the front runner. But if he wins, because China has said basically that this is a choice between peace, between war and peace. So they are saber rattling. So how do you
Mm.
think that relationship will be?
Yeah, so like you say, it's not a foregone conclusion. And as we, started speaking about, we really have a clearer view of the presidential race now. So I think, that might create some changes in the polls as we go forward. But like you say, he is the front runner for now. So if he were to win the presidential election, I do not think that it is tantamount to an immediate conflict situation. It won't immediately create conflict. He has said himself that he will pretty much be continuing the same path as Tsai Ing-wen. His foreign policy and the way he approaches it, his relationship with China, won't change much. And even though there's been some really bad blood between China and the DPP, or the Democratic Progressive Party, which he represents, I don't think he intends to make any moves that would further exacerbate those tensions between China. He will obviously continue to pursue informal participation in international organizations for Taiwan, as all of the parties would, but I just cannot see him going any further with formal. I can't see him expressing formal intentions to declare independence or go any further in that regard.
Staying on that for a minute, because one of the issues that you do have in Taiwan, since there aren't that many countries that actually have formal relationships, I think it's about 14 nations based in the Caribbean who have formal relationships with Taiwan. But the your current president, Tsai Ing-wen, has this proposal, the new southbound proposal that she has, but she wants to be in relationship, particularly with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. How
Right.
is that going to play out? Because one has to assume that that will be something that will be continued after the election. How is China viewing that?
Right. So some of, I think it's three, yeah, three of its formal diplomatic allies are actually in the Pacific region. That's Nauru, the Federation, the Micronesia, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. And I think that forms the basis for the new southbound policy. They can look to those already formal allies in that region and really pursue stronger ties with them that they hope will uh, continue to build its influence in the region. But like you say, it is in direct opposition with China, who itself is really trying to build more ties in that region because obviously it's a crucial, you know, piece of water to maintain military and diplomatic supremacy over what is, a good chunk of the whole world. So I think going forward, those attempts to build influence in the region will be focused on non-formal interactions. It will be focused on things like providing aid, providing agricultural expertise to countries that need it, and creating people-to-people cultural links, things like that.
Staying with us for a moment, in terms of the election itself, Beijing, again, as we've said, has been saber rattling. They've been flying into some of their airspace, not their sovereign airspace, but a little further away from that, which Taiwan says that airspace is what they need to be prepared in case they are invaded or there's trouble in that airspace. And also a clear disinformation campaign by China against Taiwan. So China is really looking at this in a very serious manner. Um, how does the population feel about that, or do they dismiss it and just go on about their business?
Yeah, so I think it depends on who you're looking at, really. But I think the vast majority of people are so used to this kind of cross-strait tensions that they do tend to just go about their daily business with everything happening in the background. You've got to remember that under democracy, these issues have also become highly, highly partisan. And I think there is evidence to suggest that, especially among young people, there's a tendency to turn off to this highly partisan political scene that's going on. And what that means is these issues that divide the parties, specifically cross-strait relations, are sort of relegated to the back of a lot of people's minds. Now, having said that, there are also some civil society groups who are taking this very seriously, and we see incidences which have been well reported by foreign media of, civil society groups building civil defense resilience and creating plans for, if there was a conflict, how would you evacuate? How would you maintain your water supplies, your food supplies, your supplies for life? And you've even got some groups preparing for combat training, which they are in the minority, but they're there. But I would say in general, most people, it's not on most people's mind as a daily concern.
Given that, is it more of an issue that's on the minds of people in the West, such as President Biden and Europe? And is it that serious an issue in terms of the tension between Beijing and Taiwan? Or, I mean, how seriously should the United States take what's going on right now?
Well, I think that at the very highest levels, they have a very good understanding of what Taiwan means to China and how very important, for a whole lot of reasons, politically, emotionally, historically, it's an incredibly important issue to the Chinese government and the Chinese political system. And I think at the high levels, there's a very good understanding of that. But I think in the rest of the Western world and the general public, it's not well understood. It's more seen as a kind of territorial spat that is, you know, a power struggle. And in one way it is, but there's a lot of other elements involved in it, and including the Taiwanese domestic political scene, which is incredibly influential on this. And I think that's something that is not well understood by most people when it comes to thinking about the cross-strait issue.
Now, there are other issues, obviously, for this election other than the tension with Beijing. For example, the economy of Taiwan, which economists projecting is going to grow at its slowest rate since 2009. And usually, when you have something like that, when the economy does slow down, whoever is in power is usually blamed for that. Is that taking a toll on the vice president as candidate for president right now?
I think so. So one of the main parties that we spoke about earlier, the main opposition parties, is the Taiwan People's Party, and they have developed a very strong base of support amongst young people, especially young men. And a lot of the rhetoric that they've run against the campaign rhetoric that they've run against the incumbent government is that they have allowed house prices to rise incredibly high, and they haven't done anything to make sure wages increase at the same time. And that's certainly been a powerful way to connect with young people, especially who feel disaffected by the last 8 years of Democratic Progressive Party rule. Um, Having said that, the DPP, sorry, the Democratic Progressive Party and the Kuomintang, they still have their strong bases that will continue to vote for them no matter what happens, because, as you said, the important issue of cross-strait policy. So I think really you could you could attribute this poor economic performance to the split of the opposition rather than the increasing strength of the opposition.
With that, because I know that Taiwan right now is looking to be less dependent upon imports and exports to China. and which is decreasing since COVID, quite frankly. And they're looking to engage other nations for that. And China's not that happy about that. They've put some restrictions on some of the agricultural imports and the like, but it doesn't seem to be hurting Taiwan that much. Yes, the economy will grow slower, but a lot of nations are dealing with that. So, how is that going to play out right now? Because right now, the U.S. is going to become their biggest partner when it used to be China. And so, how is that going to play out in the election?
Um, I think again, it will go back to how both parties or the major parties express their preferred alliances with either the US or Taiwan or China, right? So the Kuomintang, who seeks closer ties with China in term politically, also seeks closer ties with China economically. So they will probably push back against this a little bit. They will run the line of the high number of Taiwanese business people who do work in China, and they will say, well, what, you know, with this huge market there, why are we denying this? But then obviously there's a strong argument on the other side, like you said, like a lot of nations in the EU as well are trying to decouple, and Taiwan would like to see itself not as reliant on China for its economic prosperity, especially given the fact that you know there is that conflict there. So I think I think that will come into the election, but that will be debated. I would say less clearly in terms of which countries we're going to engage with, but more in terms of how will this affect the sort of trilateral relationship between the US, China, and Taiwan.
A big part of the Taiwanese economy are computer chips,
Mm.
the old chips industry. And the United States has passed its CHIPS Act, which wants to give incentives for chips to be built in the United States, clearly putting sanctions and restrictions on anything that will come out of China. So, how is Taiwan responding to that? Because that is a major component of the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. And some would even say that the United States protection or um, perceived support of Taiwan is in many respects based in the fact that it's the center of where it gets its chips.
Mhm.
If that begins to shift, how does Taiwan deal with that?
Yeah, so this is called the Silicon Shield. They refer to Taiwan's chip industry as the Silicon Shield, and that has been referenced directly by TSMC, that's Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation's founder, Morris Chang. So he's a highly influential person in the Taiwanese business scene and political scene as the founder of TSMC. And when the CHIPS Act was announced earlier in the year, he did make this argument. He said Taiwan's chip sector was being hollowed out, and that um, this would impact Taiwan's security and its place in the world. Of course, the US says this is not the case. It's just trying to create a market where there's more diversity and more options for sourcing. Um, I personally, I think that a bit of both is true. In one sense, it probably will reduce the US reliance on Taiwan, and it will allow, you know, leaders in the US to say, well, look, why are we focusing so much on this country here when we could build our own industry? On the other hand, I have spoken to quite a number of people, military experts and technology experts, who say that Taiwan is about 2 decades ahead of where the US is even now in terms of the high tech chip production. So, yes, the US is starting to build a base, but it will take a long time for the country to catch up to Taiwan, who still produces the world's most advanced chips and will do for some time.
Um, Going further with that, and my guess is that you are aware that President Biden has said on several occasions that if Taiwan is attacked by Beijing, that the United States would come to the aid of Taiwan. How are those remarks felt in Taiwan? I mean, how do people react to that? Is there a sense of, yes, we have the United States that'll be on our side, or do people ignore it? How do people react to that?
Yeah, I've seen some studies out recently from one prominent magazine called Commonwealth here in Taiwan, and it actually showed that while a significant number of people do believe that the US might come to Taiwan's aid, they also sort of see it quite cynically, like it is an aid that is preconditioned on geopolitical interests. Um, However, I think that statements about whether or not the US would militarily assist Taiwan in the event of a conflict are they create much less traction than, for example, if the Taiwan was to be granted access to certain international institutions, like for example, if if there was observer status at the WHO, which or other health bodies like that, that would be a much bigger news story. If different countries call for Taiwan's inclusion into the UN, that would be a bigger news story. Certain US politicians have done this, and gestures of support for Taiwan directly, rather than sort of suggestions that Taiwan would be defended in the event of a conflict do create much more traction in domestic news here. And I think to continue, sorry, that's part of why the Taiwan government has been quite successful, is that they have managed to secure a lot of these kind of informal relationships and trade deals and whatnot with economic and political partners that really resonate with Taiwanese people.
Shobi Kim, who's the running mate on the DPP, she has written about fact and criticized the United Nations for a misinterpretation of one of the resolutions that disallows Taiwan from joining the UN. And that's something that she's going to campaign for should they become president and vice president.
Yeah, so there's a important distinction to make. They when Taiwanese leaders and politicians campaign for inclusion in the UN, they're not actually asking for a seat, right? They're not asking to be recognized as a country similar to China or to US or any other countries. What they're asking for is participation in UN systems, which means, to be able to be an observer at different international bodies in the UN and to be able to have access to the meetings and the resources and to be able to have influence in the body. So I think definitely they will continue to campaign for that, because while China can sort of rebuff it and say, well, no, you will never be a sovereign, you will never be a member of the UN as a sovereign nation. Well, they can say, well, no, well, that's not actually what we're seeking, um, while at the same time appearing to seek that. I don't know if that makes sense, but they by getting access to the UN institutions, they appear to be being recognized as a country without actually officially or formally doing it. Yeah.
Facto versus de jure, which
Yeah.
Taiwan does want to be recognized. I mean, they do have a great economy. They do a lot of things well. Um, but I guess my other question would be in terms of the population itself, how do they really view this? I mean, China has said, for example, to Taiwan, that you can have one nation and two systems. Now,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, the people of Taiwan would be a little skeptical of that based upon what has happened in Hong Kong. So, but it also seems to me that a lot of the rhetoric that comes out of DPP seems to be just rhetoric because there's really no movement for them to become independent. They're not changing the Constitution in a way that says we are this sovereign nation and that. So, how much of this is really politics being played to the base, and how much of it is really what they actually feel that this is where they're heading towards?
Right. I think it's kind of both, right? Because if you look at opinion surveys, it shows that the majority of people in Taiwan want to maintain the status quo. And what is the status quo? It's this kind of ambiguous de facto independence that allows Taiwan to be essentially run its own political systems as it sees fit. It has democracy, it has elections, it has a separate government, currency, social environment. Um, and by continuing to push for this, or continuing to hint at independence, it maintains the status quo while also appealing to the base. And obviously, in democracy, you have what up until now was largely a two-party system, and then on the other side, you have the Kuomintang who will pull back against this. And at the same time, it does the same thing. It keeps it in this happy middle ground where the status quo appears to be able to continue indefinitely.
We have heard in the United States that China was looking to invade the island by 2027. Now, President Xi, when he met with President Biden, said there are no plans to invade Taiwan in 2027. But Xi Jinping has said 2049 is a critical date for the nation of China because that's the date or that's the year when he expects China to be restored to its place of greatness, which includes Taiwan.
Mm.
So the question, I guess, is that is a lot of this just kind of smoke right now and is being said for the base, but that what people really need to be aware of is maybe 20 years down the road when China will really look to be one nation inclusive of Taiwan.
Yeah, it's really hard for me to say as an outsider how people should be thinking about this so far down the track. But I will talk about the threat of imminent war in 2027. So far we have Xi Jinping said that it will not happen. I think within the last 24 hours, Tsai Ing-wen said it won't happen. Um, and we've had I think the director of the CIA in the US saying that they don't think it's going to happen, and they have other military generals saying it's not going to happen. So I really do not think that war is anywhere near close to being imminent, just given what all the experts say, really, and having followed this. I think it's much more likely as that 2049 date approaches that there will be increased efforts to economically integrate, and there'll be, you know, much more incentives offered to the Taiwanese people to, to draw them in and to actually want to be a part of some sort of one country, two systems, rather than continuing with military exercises, which actually have the effect of rallying Taiwanese people's support for their own sovereignty.
One of the issues I want to talk to you about was recently the Seventh Fleet of the U.S. Navy entered into South China Sea, which um, China, Taiwan, and Vietnam all claim ownership of or priority over. And but it seems as though that they did that on purpose. How is Taiwan reacting to that?
Right. So I didn't catch that. Did you say the Chinese ship or the US ship?
The U.S. ship,
Right.
the Seventh Fleet,
So yeah. So the Seventh Fleet sailed through the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands.
Paracel, yes.
Right. But within the last month, there's been two sailings. Um, and it's quite striking for some people to see in the same press release from the Seventh Fleet that they say this is a direct challenge to violations of international law as imposed by Taiwan and China. People don't expect to see that from the US Army. So, one explanation for this that you hear quite often is they do this to present an image of having a level playing field. So, obviously, they strongly oppose Chinese expansions in the South China Sea, but to look like they're treating all of the actors equally. They think it's important to also do these, they call them FONOPs, freedom of navigation operations, in the areas around other countries' disputed claims. Um, this this issue has actually filtered down into domestic partisan politics, however, in Taiwan. When that first sailing from the US happened past Taiwan's claimed Taiping Island, which is about 1,500 kilometers south of Taiwan. When that first happened, the Coast Guard officially denied that the US had entered territorial waters. And that was challenged by a member of the opposition in the legislature. After a while, it came out that the Minister for National Defense said that he had actually seen evidence of US ships sailing within Taiwan's territorial waters in the region. So it's become sort of a political football about who is better able to protect Taiwan's sovereignty, even though this sovereignty that's in question is an island that is much, much, much closer to the Philippines than it is to Taiwan itself.
As we get close to the election, with everything that's going on, you have an economy that's slowing. You have a China that's saber rattling. You have a nation that's trying to what it would call de-risk, using the term of the United States from China. You have China that's engaging in disinformation and flying planes into what Taiwan considers to be some of its airspace. January 14th, where do you think we are as a result of the election?
Do you mean in terms of what the outcome is likely to be,
Yes.
or, or I look, for a long time it was looking like it was a Democratic Progressive Party. It was a done deal for them, the incumbents. So Lai Ching-te and Xiao Mei-chin. It looked like that ticket would be the winner. But I think after this opposition cooperation deal failed to eventuate, I think people are going to be given a real chance to see who they're actually able to vote for and what they're able to vote for. Um, and we've already seen that in some polls that have come out since. It's become a lot closer. And some of the polls are even have all of the three parties within the margin of error of each other. Taiwan also elects president on a first past the post system, so they just need to get more than any other candidate to win. So they don't need the majority of support from the people. I really think
They just need a plurality.
yeah, right. I put it this way: I think it's a race between the Kuomintang and the Democratic Progressive Party at this point. I would be very surprised if that third party, the Taiwan People's Party, was able to make it over the line. But I think the next, what is it? It's about a month and a half of campaigning. Has the potential to have significant impact on the outcome.
So, with that, we have about a minute left. Um, the United States, when President Biden spoke with President Xi in San Francisco, and one of the things that they discussed, that neither one would interfere in the election.
Mm.
Now, obviously, you have to take that with a grain of salt on both sides of the fence, quite frankly. So, how are the people of Taiwan going to be clear of the Disinformation Act or campaign that's coming their way and has been going on for a long, long time? How are they making sure that the information that they're getting is accurate, as well as whatever the United States is doing as well? How are they doing that?
So unfortunately, it's very, very hard in Taiwan. As politics is hyper partisan, so is the media, and it's an open secret. It's not even a secret. I mean, everyone knows that the main broadcast TV stations and the main online news outlets and newspapers all have a very clear political slant. Um, what that results in is those publications that are closer to China or a Chinese identity, you might say, will be more likely to publish content that supports closer ties with China. and the people who read those outlets will they'll form that opinion maybe more strongly than people who don't. I think what people need to be doing is paying less attention to social media for their news, perhaps, which is a difficult thing to do these days when so many do. But and also really just take a close look at what all parties are saying in relation to each other and try and look at the outcomes that will be achieved by presenting those kind of narratives. But I'll say it again, unfortunately, it's a very partisan media landscape, and that makes it very difficult to sort out misinformation, whether it's deliberately delivered by an external actor or whether it's shared in the interests of promoting a particular outlet's political beliefs.
The last question to you is, should the Taiwan People's Party or the Kuomintang win, how will Taiwan be different?
Taiwan will be different because in the way that closer ties will be sought with China. In the short term, I believe that Taiwan will be offered some carrots, if you like, some maybe more access to international space. They'll be less closed out by China. China will offer some sort of token trade agreements. They will stop restrictions on imports of certain fruits and things like that. There'll be a large reduction in the amount of military exercises around the country, and there will be an increase in cross-strait exchanges between Taiwan and China, people-to-people, economic and political.
My guest today has been Jono Thomson, reporter for the Taiwan News. Jono, thank you for being with me tonight.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you.
Join us again next week as we discuss another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.